A millionaire invited her maid to a birthday celebration with the intention of humiliating her, but when she arrived, the guests stood up and... But first, remember to subscribe to our channel so we can keep sharing incredible stories. Eleanor Peterson was the kind of woman who commanded attention in every room she entered. Tall, sharp-featured, and always impeccably dressed, she exuded a presence that left most people feeling both impressed and uneasy. Her mansion, a sprawling estate in the heart of New York City, was the pinnacle of luxury, with gilded halls, crystal chandeliers, and marble floors that reflected the light like polished mirrors. Today, it was alive with preparation for her grand birthday celebration, a night designed to cement her status as one of society's most influential figures. Standing at the center of her immaculate living room, Eleanor clutched a glass of champagne and smirked as she glanced at a small handwritten envelope on the table. "And this," she said, handing it to one of her assistants, "deliver it personally to Grace. I want her to know that everyone is invited, no exceptions." Grace Thompson was Eleanor's maid. She was a soft-spoken, hard-working woman in her early 30s, with worn hands and a demeanor that radiated quiet strength. Grace lived alone in a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city, spending most of her time earning an honest living or volunteering at local shelters in her free hours. Her life was humble, but she found joy in its simplicity. When Grace received the invitation, she was perplexed. An elegant ivory envelope addressed to her personally. Eleanor's parties were legendary, a gathering of the city's elite where the gowns cost more than houses and conversations revolved around investment portfolios and private vacations to the Amalfi Coast. Grace had no business being there, and yet, "Maybe it's her way of showing gratitude," Grace murmured to herself, holding the delicate invitation between her fingers. She didn't have anything to wear that would fit into such a lavish environment, but after borrowing a modest blue dress from her friend and carefully pinning up her hair, she felt hopeful. Perhaps, for one night, she would experience something beautiful. The evening of the party arrived. Eleanor's mansion sparkled like a beacon in the night, its large bay windows glowing warmly from within. The driveway was lined with luxury cars, and a valet in a crisp uniform opened the grand doors to each arriving guest. Inside, the hall pulsed with the low hum of music, laughter, and clinking glasses. The guests, politicians, artists, business magnates, were dressed to the nines, draped in silks and jewels, exchanging compliments and subtle jabs with perfect smiles. At exactly 8 p.m., Grace arrived at the mansion, clutching a small clutch purse tightly in her gloved hands. She stepped nervously into the grand entryway, where a doorman greeted her with a polite nod. Her breath caught as she took in the scene. Golden chandeliers, trays of hors d'oeuvres carried by uniformed waiters, and guests swirling around like figures in a painting. Eleanor, watching from the upper balcony, narrowed her eyes and smiled like a cat watching a mouse. "Perfect," she whispered to herself. "Let's see how long she lasts." Grace's entrance, however, did not go unnoticed. As she stepped further into the hall, conversations began to slow and heads turned one by one. A soft murmur rippled through the crowd, barely audible at first but growing in intensity. The guests stared, not with ridicule but with something else entirely. Before Grace could process what was happening, something extraordinary occurred. The room fell into a hush, and slowly, the guests began to stand. First, one man in the corner rose from his seat. Then another couple near the piano stood as well, exchanging glances of recognition. Soon the entire hall was on its feet. Grace froze, her heart pounding. Confusion and embarrassment flooded her cheeks as every pair of eyes fixed on her. She took a step back instinctively, wondering if she had done something wrong. From above, Eleanor's smug expression faltered. She leaned forward, gripping the railing tightly as whispers filled the air. "What is this?" she hissed, her voice dripping with disbelief. Grace, meanwhile, was overwhelmed. Why were they standing? Why were they clapping? And why were tears forming in the eyes of the older gentleman now making his way toward her? In that moment, Eleanor's carefully crafted plan began to unravel before her very eyes. The sound of applause grew louder, echoing through the gilded halls of Eleanor Peterson's mansion. Grace stood frozen in the center of the grand entryway, her borrowed dress suddenly feeling too small for the weight of the moment. Her face flushed crimson, and she could barely steady her breathing as dozens of eyes turned to her. Elegant men and women draped in wealth and power rose to their feet, not with scorn or mockery, as she might have expected, but with what seemed like admiration. "Who is she?" Eleanor's voice hissed sharply from the balcony above. Her question hung unanswered in the air, as even her closest friends seated below exchanged bewildered glances. A man in his 60s, tall with a commanding presence, began moving through the crowd toward Grace. His silver hair glistened beneath the glow of the chandeliers, and his tailored navy suit spoke of both taste and authority. As he approached, Grace recognized the faint lines of his face, softened by an expression of disbelief. His hands trembled slightly, as if he were seeing a ghost. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice carrying a deep resonance that silenced even the murmurs in the room. "Is it really you?" Grace blinked, struggling to find her voice. "I'm sorry, sir, but do I know you?" The man let out a soft, disbelieving laugh and turned to the crowd, addressing the guests as though unveiling a long-lost treasure. "Do you see who this is?" His voice shook with emotion. "This is Grace Thompson, the daughter of Benjamin Thompson, one of the greatest men I ever had the privilege to know." Gasps rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. A woman in pearls placed a hand over her mouth. Two men exchanged stunned looks, as if unable to process what they had just heard. Grace could feel the weight of their attention now, heavier, sharper, yet filled with reverence, not pity. Eleanor's fingers dug into the polished banister above, her carefully manicured nails turning white. "Benjamin Thompson," she whispered to herself, her confidence faltering. The name rang through her mind like a bell, reverberating with memories of headlines and stories told at dinner parties long ago. Philanthropist, business mogul, visionary. He had been a man loved by the public and respected even among the powerful elite. But he had disappeared from society years before his death. The wealth that defined him had evaporated, and rumors swirled that his family had chosen a life of seclusion. Many thought that Thompson's legacy had been buried alongside him. And yet, here was Grace, standing humbly in the middle of a grand party, as though unaware of her own significance. "Forgive me, Miss Thompson," the man continued, his voice now softer, almost paternal. "Your father changed so many lives, including mine. I worked alongside him for years on the Thompson Foundation's charitable projects, the schools he built, the hospitals he funded. His kindness shaped this city." He smiled faintly, his eyes brimming with admiration. "You have his eyes. It's unmistakable." Grace swallowed hard, the mention of her father piercing her like an arrow. Memories of him, softened by time, but etched permanently into her heart, flashed before her eyes. She remembered holding his hand as they visited orphanages on weekends, watching as he offered kindness without judgment to those who had nothing. He had been her hero, not because of his wealth, but because of the goodness that defined his every action. I don't know what to say," she stammered, her voice barely audible. A murmur spread through the crowd again, now filled with awe and curiosity. Eleanor descended the grand staircase, her expression a mask of forced composure. She plastered on a brittle smile, though her eyes betrayed her confusion. "Well," she said, her voice ringing falsely cheerful, "this is quite the surprise." The older gentleman ignored Eleanor entirely, his focus remaining on Grace. "Where have you been all these years, my dear?" he asked gently. "After your father passed, no one ever heard from the Thompsons again." Grace hesitated. She could feel Eleanor's eyes drilling into her, demanding answers that had nothing to do with kindness. We chose to live simply," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "My father's values were always about giving, not taking. When we lost him, my mother and I decided that a quiet life, one of service to others, was the only way to honor his memory." The guests were silent, hanging on her every word. Eleanor, however, was seething. This was not how the night was supposed to go. She had invited Grace to humiliate her, to expose her as a clumsy, insignificant nobody amidst a sea of wealth and power. Yet here she was, effortlessly commanding the admiration of the room. A voice from the crowd called out, "She's just like him!" Another chimed in, "The same grace, the same kindness." Grace's eyes widened at the unexpected praise. "I don't deserve that," she said softly. "Nonsense," the older man replied, his voice firm. "Your father would be proud, and tonight we are honored to have you here with us." As the applause began again, this time louder and more genuine than before, Eleanor felt something foreign stir within her, panic. Her plan was unraveling, and for the first time in years, she had no control over the room. "Who is ready for a toast?" she called suddenly, her voice cutting sharply through the noise. "We're here to celebrate, after all." The crowd quieted, but the energy in the room had shifted permanently. Eleanor's words fell flat, her usual command over her audience slipping through her fingers like sand. All eyes remained on Grace, on the quiet dignity of a woman who had walked into the lion's den, only to emerge as the true heart of the evening. As waiters moved through the crowd with trays of champagne, Eleanor's gaze fell once more on Grace. Her expression hardened into a mask of cold resentment. This wasn't over. But Grace, for her part, barely noticed Eleanor at all. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not as someone beneath others, but as someone worthy of their respect. The echo of applause still lingered in the grand hall, though Eleanor Peterson could hardly hear it over the roar of her thoughts. She descended the final step of the staircase with calculated poise, her heels clicking against the marble like the ticking of a bomb. A brittle smile stretched across her lips, but anyone who knew her well could see the tension in her shoulders and the fire in her eyes. This was her night, her celebration, yet somehow Grace Thompson, her maid, had become the center of attention. The guests still murmured amongst themselves, glancing at Grace with a mixture of awe and curiosity. They whispered stories about Benjamin Thompson, the visionary philanthropist who had shaped so much of the city with his kindness and fortune. "She looks just like him," someone said. "Same humility, it's incredible." Eleanor's jaw tightened. For a brief moment she had been the queen of the room, admired and envied as always. Now her guests fawned over Grace. Grace, as though she were royalty reborn. It was intolerable. "Grace, my dear," Eleanor called out with forced sweetness as she approached, champagne flute in hand. "You're the talk of the evening. I had no idea your father was so—" She searched for a word that wouldn't betray her resentment. "Distinguished." Grace, still flustered, looked up at Eleanor with soft, apologetic eyes. "I didn't mean to cause a distraction, Mrs. Peterson." "A distraction?" Eleanor let out a tight, artificial laugh. "Nonsense. This is your moment, isn't it?" She turned to the guests nearest her, raising her glass. "To Benjamin Thompson's legacy and his remarkable daughter." The toast sounded more like a declaration of war than a tribute. A few guests raised their glasses, but the energy was strained. The warmth that had filled the room moments earlier now overshadowed by Eleanor's brittle demeanor. "Mrs. Peterson," a voice interrupted. It was the older gentleman, the one who had recognized Grace. His name was Charles Whitmore, a prominent investor and old friend of Benjamin Thompson's. He regarded Eleanor with polite disapproval, his sharp gaze cutting through her veneer of control. "Surely you were aware of Grace's background when you invited her tonight?" Eleanor froze, though her smile didn't waver. "Of course," she lied, waving off the question as though it were absurd. "Why, Grace has been part of my household for—" "Part of your household?" Charles echoed, his voice cool but sharp. A few guests exchanged glances. The room grew quieter. Eleanor suddenly felt exposed, as though her every move were being dissected. "Yes," Grace said softly, stepping forward. "I work for Mrs. Peterson as her maid." The room fell utterly silent. The word hung in the air like a weight. For a moment, Eleanor felt a flicker of satisfaction. Finally, Grace would be seen for what she was, someone beneath them, someone insignificant. But to her horror, the silence didn't give way to mockery or ridicule. Instead, it deepened the room's respect for Grace. "She chose service," someone whispered from the crowd. "To honor her father's values," said another. Grace shifted uncomfortably under the attention. She had never wanted this, not the spotlight, not the whispers of admiration. "It's honest work," she said quietly, her voice barely rising above the silence. "My father believed that dignity came from kindness, no matter the task. I try to live the same way." Charles Whitmore smiled warmly, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "And you do, Grace. Your father would be proud." Eleanor felt her composure slipping. This was spiraling out of her control. She had expected Grace to shrink under the weight of embarrassment, to flee the party in humiliation. Instead, Grace's humility had turned into a crown, one that her guests now placed atop her head with reverence. "This is ridiculous," Eleanor snapped, the bitterness seeping through her practiced charm. "She's a maid, for heaven's sake. You're all acting like she's someone worth admiring," Charles cut in sharply, his voice low but commanding. "Because she is." Eleanor faltered, shocked into silence. She glanced around, searching for support among her guests, but found none. Instead, the faces around her were stony, their gazes heavy with judgment. It was she who looked small now, her cruelty laid bare in a room filled with people she had once considered friends. A young woman near the back of the room stepped forward hesitantly. "Miss Thompson," she said, her voice wavering, "I think I met your father when I was a child. My parents took me to one of his foundation events. He gave me a book, and he told me to always believe in the power of learning. I still have it." Grace smiled faintly, her eyes glistening with tears. "That sounds like him." More guests began to step forward, sharing their own memories of Benjamin Thompson, moments of kindness, generosity, and wisdom that had touched their lives in ways they'd never forgotten. Eleanor could do nothing but watch as her party, the meticulously planned spectacle she had designed to elevate herself, transformed into a tribute to the Thompson family's legacy. The warmth in the room was palpable, a quiet hum of shared respect and admiration. And at the center of it all was Grace, standing with quiet dignity, embodying the very values her father had lived by. "You've embarrassed yourself, Eleanor," Charles said softly as he passed her, his tone laced with quiet disappointment. "You invited her here to humiliate her, didn't you? I suggest you reflect on what that says about you." Eleanor stood rooted to the spot, her cheeks burning with shame. The celebration she had so carefully orchestrated had turned against her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Meanwhile, Grace found herself surrounded by guests who spoke to her with genuine warmth, as though she were an old friend finally returning home. For the first time in years, she felt seen, not as a servant, but as herself. And Eleanor, watching from the shadows, realized with growing dread that this night, her night, would be remembered for all the wrong reasons. The energy in the room had shifted entirely. What was once Eleanor Peterson's meticulously planned birthday celebration had transformed into an unexpected tribute to a legacy Eleanor had failed to anticipate, Grace Thompson's legacy. The warm, golden glow of the chandeliers now seemed colder to Eleanor, every flickering light exposing her fragile facade. Guests who had once gravitated to her orbit were now drawn to Grace, forming small circles around her as they shared stories of her father, Benjamin Thompson. It was as though the man himself had walked back into their lives, his humility and kindness reflected in Grace's soft smile and composed demeanor. Eleanor stood near the edge of the room, gripping her untouched glass of champagne so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her heart raced as she watched Charles Whitmore laughing warmly with Grace, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder as though they were old friends reunited. "This isn't happening," Eleanor whispered under her breath, her voice trembling. She scanned the crowd, desperate to find at least one guest who shared her discontent. But the more she looked, the more she realized that no one seemed interested in her anymore. She turned sharply, nearly bumping into Caroline Marshall, one of her oldest friends and the reigning queen of gossip among their social circle. "Caroline," Eleanor said through gritted teeth, forcing a smile, "don't you think this has gone far enough? I mean, Grace Thompson. These people are acting like she's royalty." Caroline tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. "And maybe she is, Eleanor. Isn't it fascinating? Who would have thought Benjamin Thompson's daughter would be here tonight? In your home, of all places." She sipped her champagne, eyes glittering. "You really should be proud." "What a moment!" "Proud," Eleanor snapped, unable to contain herself. "She's a maid, Caroline. A maid! How can you people forget that?" Caroline's smile faltered, and her expression hardened. "A maid who holds herself with more grace and dignity than most of us, Eleanor." She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Eleanor standing alone, her heart pounding furiously in her chest. The final thread of Eleanor's control unraveled. "They're laughing at me," she thought. "This is my night, and it's slipping through my fingers." Determined to reclaim her authority, Eleanor marched through the crowd, her heels echoing like gunshots against the marble floor. The hum of conversations quieted as she approached Grace, who stood near the fireplace, surrounded by a group of guests. Charles Whitmore glanced up as Eleanor arrived, his smile fading as he recognized the storm in her eyes. "Grace," Eleanor said sharply, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "May I have a word with you, privately?" Grace blinked, surprised by Eleanor's tone, but she nodded politely. "Of course, Mrs. Peterson." The guests exchanged wary glances as Eleanor led Grace into an adjoining study, a smaller, darker room adorned with leather-bound books and heavy mahogany furniture. Eleanor shut the door behind them with more force than necessary and turned to face Grace, her composure hanging by a thread. "What is this?" Eleanor hissed, her voice low but seething. "What game are you playing, Grace? Did you plan this? Did you know this would happen?" Grace looked stunned, shaking her head. "No, Mrs. Peterson, I didn't plan anything. I didn't even know anyone would recognize me." Eleanor let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, don't play the innocent with me. You've turned my party into some ridiculous spectacle. My guests are fawning over you like you're something special." Grace's brow furrowed, hurt flashing briefly across her face. "I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't want the attention." "But you got it anyway, didn't you?" Eleanor snapped. "And look at you, acting so humble and gracious, it's nauseating." Grace stared at Eleanor, her expression a mixture of pity and sadness. "Why are you doing this? Why did you invite me tonight if you didn't want me here?" Eleanor's mask cracked, her carefully constructed confidence giving way to resentment. "Because I wanted to remind you of your place, Grace. That's why. But instead you've embarrassed me in front of everyone." The words hung in the air like poison. Grace inhaled sharply, as though the confession had struck her physically. She stood silent for a moment, processing the cruelty Eleanor had hidden behind polite smiles for so long. Finally she spoke, her voice calm but steady. "You know, Mrs. Peterson, I've worked for you for years. I've cleaned your floors, polished your silver, and kept your secrets. I never asked for anything from you, not respect, not kindness. But tonight—" Grace shook her head. "Tonight, I see you for who you really are. You invited me here not to celebrate, but to humiliate me. That says far more about you than it ever could about me." Eleanor flinched, as though Grace's words had struck a nerve. "Don't you dare talk to me like that," she spat, her voice rising. "You're nothing, Grace, nothing but a maid." Grace straightened, her chin lifting slightly. "And yet somehow you're the one standing here alone." The study fell silent, save for the distant hum of voices from the party beyond. Eleanor's face paled, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Grace held her gaze for a moment longer before turning and walking calmly to the door. She paused with her hand on the knob, glancing back once more. "For what it's worth, I hope one day you find the kindness you're so afraid of showing," she said softly. And then she was gone, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the darkened room, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. The soft hum of conversation resumed as Grace re-entered the grand hall, though this time it carried a different tone, one of warmth, of admiration. As she quietly slipped back into the crowd, the guests turned to her once more, smiling with genuine respect. Grace didn't know what to say or how to react to all the sudden attention, but her humility remained steadfast. It was as though her father's spirit, the man everyone remembered so fondly, walked alongside her. Near the fireplace, Charles Whitmore approached her again, his expression filled with quiet pride. "Grace," he said gently, "you are more like your father than I think you realize. Benjamin would have loved to see you tonight. You carry his legacy with such dignity." "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore," Grace replied, her voice soft but sincere. "I just tried to live the way he taught me." Charles nodded, but his gaze shifted past Grace toward the edge of the room, where Eleanor Peterson now stood alone, isolated in her own mansion. Eleanor's once commanding presence had dissolved entirely. She was a shadow of herself, lingering in a corner as though she no longer belonged. The guests who once gravitated toward her avoided her now, too polite to acknowledge her humiliation, but unwilling to offer her comfort. She watched as Grace spoke quietly with Charles, and a bitterness she couldn't suppress bubbled to the surface. How could this happen? The question gnawed at her. She had invited Grace to be humiliated, yet the plan had unraveled so spectacularly that Eleanor herself had become the evening's outcast. The guests, her guests, had turned against her, moved not by power or wealth, but by a simple woman who reminded them of what truly mattered. Eleanor gripped her empty champagne flute, the crystal trembling in her hand. She couldn't let the night end like this. "Everyone!" Eleanor's voice rang out suddenly, slicing through the soft murmur of conversation. All heads turned toward her, and for the first time there was no awe in their expressions, only curiosity and, in some, faint disappointment. Eleanor's forced smile faltered for just a moment, but she pressed on, lifting her glass high. "I think we can all agree this has been a most unexpected evening," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "And I'd like to take a moment to toast our dear guest, Grace Thompson." Grace turned, surprised by the sudden attention. Charles frowned, clearly wary of Eleanor's intentions. "She's inspired us all," Eleanor continued, the words tasting bitter on her tongue, "reminding us of the importance of humility and service. It's a powerful lesson, isn't it?" She looked around the room, waiting for applause, but the silence that followed was far heavier than she'd anticipated. Eleanor's hands shook slightly. "Why isn't anyone clapping? Grace stepped forward, her calm demeanor drawing every eye in the room. "Mrs. Peterson," she said gently, "thank you for your kind words." The room seemed to hold its breath as Grace paused, searching for the right way to continue. "But I think tonight isn't really about me," she said softly. "It's about all of us remembering that kindness costs nothing, that we all have the ability to make someone's life better, even in the smallest of ways. That's what my father believed, and it's what I try to live by." A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd. People nodded, their faces softened by Grace's words. "You don't have to be powerful or wealthy to change the world," Grace continued. "Sometimes the simplest acts of compassion make the greatest difference." She glanced toward Eleanor, her expression free of anger or resentment, only understanding. "Even tonight," she added, "I know that this party, however it began, has brought us all together in an unexpected way. And for that, I'm grateful." The room erupted in applause, not polite or hesitant, but genuine and heartfelt. Guests smiled, clapping with real admiration, their gazes filled with respect for Grace and her quiet strength. Eleanor stood frozen, her face pale, as Grace's words washed over her. The applause wasn't for her. It wasn't her party anymore, and deep down she knew it never would be again. Charles Whitmore stepped up to Grace and shook her hand warmly. "Your father would be proud tonight, Grace. You've reminded us of what truly matters." "Thank you," Grace said, her voice trembling with emotion. As the applause slowly faded, Grace turned toward the grand doors. She didn't need to stay any longer. The evening had given her more than she ever expected, a chance to honor her father, to remind others of his legacy, and to walk away with her head held high. Before she left, however, she glanced back at Eleanor one last time. The older woman stood apart from the crowd, still clutching her empty glass, her shoulders slumped in quiet defeat. Grace hesitated, then crossed the room toward her, unnoticed by the guests now engaged in laughter and conversation. Eleanor didn't look up as Grace stopped beside her. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Finally, Grace broke the silence. "Good night, Mrs. Peterson," she said softly. "I hope you'll be all right." Eleanor's gaze flickered toward Grace, her expression unreadable. "Why would you care?" she whispered bitterly. "Because kindness isn't about who deserves it," Grace replied. "It's about who needs it." Without waiting for a response, Grace turned and walked away, the faint click of her shoes echoing softly in Eleanor's ears. Eleanor watched her go, the words hanging heavy in the air around her. For the first time in her life, she felt small, not because of Grace, but because of herself. Her cruelty, her arrogance, her attempt to humiliate someone she considered beneath her had only revealed her own emptiness. And for the first time, Eleanor felt a stirring of something unfamiliar. Shame. As Grace disappeared through the doors into the cool night, the guests began to disperse, their conversations lingering on stories of Benjamin Thompson and his remarkable daughter. The echoes of Grace's humility and wisdom would follow them long after they left the mansion. Eleanor stood alone in her empty hall, surrounded by glittering decorations and the remnants of a party she had lost control of entirely. For the first time in her life, she realized that a person's worth wasn't measured by wealth or power, but by the way they chose to treat others. And in that quiet moment, Eleanor Peterson understood how far she had fallen.